Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Otto Von Bismarck Part 4, The Iron Chancellor by Extra History. Last time we saw as Bismarck built up Prussia's international reputation so it could compete with the more well-established Austria. I think in this episode we will begin to see some of Bismarck's plans come to fruition. Now, if you guys enjoyed this one, I would appreciate it if you would check out the Patreon. It is linked down below, and it will give you access to exclusive reaction content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this video.
It is go time in Bismarck land.
Alright, here we go.
Bismarck had a list, and he was checking it twice. Action item number 1 on that list: steamroll some Danes.
Yes.
16 years prior, in 1848, Prussia had invaded Denmark with the hopes...
This might seem like it's sort of come out of nowhere, but remember, we've been focusing specifically on Bismarck's mission to compete with Austria, but there's a whole lot more going on even beyond that. And that's where Denmark comes into all of this.
...of annexing the largely German-speaking duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. But the threat of international intervention had sent them packing.
Yes.
Now it was time for revenge. Or at least a very pragmatic seizure of territory. You see, the Danish king had just cacked it, and as basically always happens when a European king checks out, his death left everybody scrambling over the succession.
Yes, we have a very classic succession crisis here, which means not only a succession crisis for Denmark, but also for Schleswig and Holstein, which sort of, as you can imagine, opens up a lot of opportunities. Well, who exactly should these provinces go to? Austria's looking, Prussia's looking, of course Denmark wants to keep its hold, a lot of the other German states have their eyes on this crisis.
And in this case, that scramble was played out between one staunchly Danish branch of the family and one sympathetic to the Germans.
Yes.
When the Danish group won out, they decided that it was high time to rule Schleswig and Holstein directly, to finally incorporate them into the Kingdom of Denmark, not to leave them as semi-independent duchies with their own weird rules and privileges. This violated a treaty the Danes had signed with the Prussians, though, and gave Bismarck his chance. But it also made things tricky. After all, if Bismarck used ideas of liberating the oppressed and defending smaller nations' rights to justify invading Schleswig-Holstein, he'd have to find a really good reason for sticking around to occupy those places himself. And
yes, so we've got a tricky situation here. Bismarck has to act delicately, though he is pretty good at this type of thing. It's also worth remembering because they're now pointing out sort of the political and ideological part of this. This is really an era of strong nationalism. Nationalism is really building, and particularly this ethnic and linguistic nationalism, I think in many ways sort of stronger, or at least more of a motivating political force than it even is today. And so we have these German-speaking provinces. There's a big pull towards the German states, towards a German-speaking power like Prussia, of course away from Denmark. And to be clear, in this whole succession debacle, Bismarck originally supports Christian IX, I believe the Danish successor is, who is the more sort of standard Danish status quo candidate, but he obviously completely disagrees with the decision to directly annex these two provinces. And so now, as they're pointing out, Bismarck has to make up a very good reason for him to get Prussia in there, but also a good reason that will allow them to stay afterwards.
instead of just leaving again. He had been setting up these dominoes for a while, though. There would be no repeat of the last time when they had to flee due to other powers coming in on the side of the Danes. He had already secured the friendship of the Russians, and made vague promises to the French that they might see some territory out of the whole deal if—
Brilliant. And so Bismarck understands something really, really important about these sort of international affairs, which is, you know, it's not just about how militarily powerful your country is. It's about making allies and keeping those allies happy. Like I mentioned last time, this is something that Austria has understood for a long, long time. This is something that Prussia has been learning, but under Bismarck, he's an absolute expert at this. He's got Russia, he's got France, he's already been building up those relationships, but it gets even better from here.
If Prussia was allowed to absorb Schleswig and Holstein. And without Russia or France, Britain would protest, but they'd never actually go to war on the Danish side.
Yep.
He had also suckered in Austria, convincing them that they were all on the same side. Germans defending Germans and all that.
There you go. And that's what I mean when I say it gets even better from here. Austria was just about the best country to bring in. Now, sure, it is great to have all these allies on your side, to have France with you, to have Russia with you, knowing that Britain won't actually intervene, but this is sort of a German affair, or at least it's being framed that way. It's being framed as, well, Denmark wants to dominate these ethnically German-speaking provinces, we need to get in there. And Prussia is taking the initiative, even though, there are a lot of other German states who could also claim that same initiative. But which is the only other German, or at least partially German state that has that same power level as Prussia and who could actually compete? Austria. And so Bismarck, in his masterful way, brings Austria in on this. He doesn't want to compete with them over this, even though they are big-time adversaries in general, and their relationship will quickly become very, very heated, more heated than it has been. But in this particular instance, he knows that the best way to legitimize this, to legitimize Prussia's actions, is to bring Austria in along for the ride, because then you have the two most powerful German states agreeing on this same thing. Are the other German states really going to make much of a fuss? No, they're probably going to go along with it. So, very, very smart.
He even convinced them to be allies and contribute a horde of troops to the effort. And this is key. Not only did he need Austrian troops to secure a quick victory, but it would also make them complicit.
Yes.
If, after they won, he said that Prussia was going to take territory, the Austrians wouldn't walk away without their share, which not only meant that European public opinion wouldn't turn against Prussia, but also meant that he wouldn't lose the moral high ground in the German Confederacy.
Brilliant. So, he's bringing Austria in order to legitimize Prussia's actions, like I said, but he's also sort of latching on to Austria's international clout, Austria's international relationships and diplomacy. He's latching onto that in order to legitimize Prussia's actions and make Prussia appear a little bit better.
And his plan worked perfectly.
Yeah.
The combined Prussian-Austrian forces rapidly overran Denmark. The Danes had to grant the independence of Schleswig and Holstein. Bismarck made some ludicrous demands, and the Austrians, not wanting to be left out, eventually caved to a compromise that left Bismarck exactly where he actually wanted to be. Prussia would keep Schleswig, the Austrians would get Holstein, and he would get a small pile of other minor concessions to boot.
And this is just, I wouldn't even call it like modern political thinking, because the idea of making alliances and not acting unilaterally has been an idea in one way or another for a long time. It's just a very intelligent way of doing things, both at this time and today. I mean, we think about international politics today. Yeah, sure, if you're a big, powerful country, you can act unilaterally, which means, on your own. You can make that decision on your own, but it always makes you look more legitimate, and it always strengthens your case when you act with other powers, either a coalition of other powers or other powerful countries. And let's be honest, when we're talking about international politics, a lot of it is sort of a game of reputation. It's all these countries interacting with each other, does this appear legitimate? When we talk about international legitimacy, right, there are certain rules that we've made up to our international affairs, but those rules are just made up. So if something can appear legitimate to those who matter, then there you go. It is legitimate, and Bismarck understands this very well. He understands how to play this game.
But Bismarck was always a man of large appetites. He didn't come all this way to only get Schleswig. And so, part 2 of the plan commenced. Operation Make Fun of Austrian Incompetence. He played up everything that went wrong in Holstein, and talked openly about it being a breeding ground for revolutionaries.
And here you go. So you've brought Austria in on the Danish side of things. You've gained the territory you wanted. Now you turn it back on Austria. Now they become the problem.
His sound and fury brought the two nations to the brink of war, but both of their monarchs wanted to avoid such a conflict between brothers. Wilhelm accepted the possibility of war, but forbade Bismarck from explicitly goading the Austrians anymore. But Bismarck's work on that front was already done. He had a backup plan in case war didn't come. Bismarck always had a backup plan, but he spent most of his time trying to shore up alliances, to make sure that Prussia was ready for the fight his king sort of didn't want.
Yeah, and I feel now's probably a good time to mention if we're talking about the build-up to war, because we've already had this war with Denmark, and now we're building up towards a much bigger conflict. It's worth talking about sort of the state of Prussia's military at this point. It's worth talking about a couple of important people. Now, we've been really focused on Bismarck, this brilliant political leader, but there's two other individuals I want to bring up. The first is Albrecht von Rohen. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly. I do not know German, so apologies for the pronunciation, but he's the Minister of War during this time period, and he is a sort of big military modernizer. Now, all of these guys are part of the conservative faction, some more extreme, some more moderate, but von Rohen is this, or von Rohen, is this, conservative Minister of War who, like I said, is a big-time modernizer, wants to move Prussia's military forward. And so he plays a big role in getting Prussia ready for these military engagements. And then we also have Helmut von Moltke, the Elder. We say the Elder because many are familiar with his nephew, the younger Helmut von Moltke, who serves as general in World War I, plays a very important role in World War I, but we're talking about the Elder, Field Marshal. When we talk about fighting on the ground, the actual strategy and tactics, von Moltke is who we're talking about, this brilliant general who really leads Prussia to many of these military victories. And we'll definitely see more of him as we get through the rest of the series, but, these three, Bismarck, von Rohen, von Moltke, when we're talking about Prussia's military preparedness, these three absolutely need to be mentioned, really sort of crucially important figures.
First, the Italians. Victor Emmanuel, the man trying to unify Italy, desperately wanted to take over Venice, which was in Austrian hands.
Yes, and it's worth remembering, as they just pointed out, that Italy is going through its own unification struggle at this point. It's funny, both Germany and Italy sort of attempt some sort of nationalism and unification during 1848. It falls flat in both cases, but after 1848, after the recovery, nationalism is still this very strong political force, and so now both the Germans and the Italians have started this much longer, in some cases decades-long process of unifying these two countries. I mean, if you look at a map of Europe today, you'll see the country of Italy and the country of Germany, so we know that they were successful. So Italy's been going through its own unification struggle, and Italy, for a long, long time, or when I say Italy, I'm talking about a variety of Italian states, especially if we go a little further back, it's becoming more unified, still not entirely. Italy has had to deal with Austrian domination of northern Italy. Austria has for a long time been the major power of that region, which of course presents an issue if you're trying to form a united Italy. You sort of want to push Austria out of there and establish yourself as the dominant power of northern Italy.
I mean, how can you have an Italy with no Venice? But he was never going to have the strength to fight Austria alone, and
Right.
so Bismarck seized on this, getting him to agree that if Prussia and Austria went to war, the newly formed Italian kingdom would join in for only the small price of one Venice,
Yep.
which Bismarck didn't really want anyway. Next, the French. While not publicly successful in securing the French as allies, Bismarck was dealing with Napoleon III here, a man too clever for his own good by half. Napoleon III, who saw himself as the equal of his...
That's funny. Yeah, and as they're putting out, Napoleon III, it really harkened back to the legacy of Napoleon Bonaparte. He really wanted to connect himself, present himself as an equal to the original Napoleon show, that he was just as great. I think most would agree it didn't end up that way. He was not nearly as great. He really could not live up to those expectations, but that is what he liked to try to do. And, we'll see a bit more of him in this series.
famous uncle, but really wasn't, took the only course of action that would get him nothing. He wouldn't support Prussia, but he wouldn't support Austria.
Brilliant.
This was just fine by Bismarck. Finally, Bismarck kept pressure on Austria, having Prussian officials meet with Romanians and Magyars, Czechs and Serbs.
So, Bismarck, just so great at exploiting the political trends of the era, especially that nationalism. Bismarck is really sort of tuned into that. Of course, the German nationalism, that's sort of the whole point of the German unification project, but in this case, he's trying to utilize the various ethnicities present within the Habsburg Empire to sort of put a little pressure on Austria. You know, I don't know if he's necessarily trying to cause a revolution, that might be a little far, but he's meeting with all these different ethnicities that form the multi-ethnic Austrian Empire, which is becoming a bigger and bigger issue because of that nationalism. And Bismarck's going, why don't I just prod a little bit here, poke a little bit here, see how comfortable you are, Austria.
Ethnic minority within the Austrian Empire, all in order to make it look like he was building allies and raising legions of revolutionaries ready to revolt the moment the Austrians went to war. But Bismarck's...
And to be fair, I don't think he... Like I said, I don't think he necessarily was raising legions of revolutionaries within Austria, but if you can even make it appear that way, that's a big threat to Austria.
Plans were interrupted by one thing he did not factor in. As he walked down the great boulevard Unter den Linden, 2 shots broke the quiet. He whirls. A young man stands before him, revolver in hand. The 51-year-old Bismarck grabs him. 3 more shots ring out as they grapple. Finally, soldiers run up and subdue the young man. As the assassin is hauled off, they check Bismarck for wounds. One finds a hole in his coat, and follows it to find a hole in his waistcoat, which, with some trepidation, he follows to find a hole in Bismarck's shirt. All 5 shots had hit, but every one of them had either only grazed him or bounced off of his ribs.
Whew. There you go. You know, if those shots had been a little bit different, how much history could have changed? How about that? And, you know, you can't talk about the politics of this era without an assassination attempt. I mean, it's just par for the course.
In a moment that history doesn't record, but I think we all know happened, Bismarck simply nodded to the soldier, said, "Iron Chancellor," put on shades, and walked away.
Yes, well, he wouldn't have been the Iron Chancellor quite at that point, but, you know, we can imagine that he might have done that if we want to.
Refusing to let one measly assassination attempt get in the way of a good war, Bismarck went right back to work getting the German-speaking world to tear itself apart.
Yep.
And as rumors swirled, the Austrians felt they had to make a move. So they called the Pan-German Diet in Frankfurt to decide the issue of Schleswig and Holstein. The Diet moved against Prussia, but this played right into Bismarck's hand. The moment the Diet came to their decision, the Prussian representative read a statement that Bismarck had prepared for just such a moment, declaring the Diet invalid and the German Confederation dissolved. Now it would be war.
And I feel like we said the exact same thing last time, but think back on Bismarck's blood and iron speech. Yeah, he's definitely acting in accord with his beliefs. He is not letting this be decided by speeches and votes. He's shutting this down. He's letting this be decided by blood and iron. You know, I really think it's just a very clear illustration of his political principles, or at the very least, a very clear illustration of his beliefs. You know, this is how it has to be. This is how Prussia works its way towards success.
It would be the northern German states and Prussia against the southern German states and the Austrian Empire. Hundreds of thousands of men were mustered. It could have been a long war, but now the king had in his service a general as capable on the battlefield as Bismarck was in the conference room, General Moltke.
I guess I spoke a little too soon, but there we have Moltke. Very essential individual to bring up. I don't know if they're going to bring up von Rohen, but just remember, he's important in sort of a more general way, is that, you know, sort of modernizer, minister of war position. But when we're talking about this war, this conflict in particular, von Moltke, yeah, essential.
The uncle of the General Moltke, who will
Yep.
so disastrously lead the German forces into the First World War, this Moltke could not have been more different from his nephew. He was one of the first to see that the modern rifle had made the idea of the frontal charge obsolete. He grasped the importance of railroads for mobilization, and realized that modern armies were too big to be commanded by one man, that plans should be flexible, and subordinates should be allowed to take initiative within them.
Yep.
It was this Moltke who famously said, "Plans never survive contact with the enemy."
I mean, this is a very famous quote, but some brilliant stuff here. You know, all of those ideas they just listed, we're really talking about some of the foundations of sort of modern warfare. It's not like von Moltke was the only person to think of this. There were some pretty brilliant military theorists at this time, but he is very influential, of course, especially in a German context. And that's why I brought him up earlier when we were talking about preparation for war. Sure, this series is about Bismarck, and none of this happens without Bismarck. He is truly crucial to creating the circumstances for German unification under Prussia to happen, at least in the way that it did happen. But when we're talking about the military success, yeah, that doesn't happen without von Moltke, at least not as quickly or as successfully for Prussia as it did happen.
Moltke led a lightning war, crushing the once great Austrian Empire within weeks. And now, where Bismarck had once had to work so hard to get the king to go to war, their success had been so great that he had to work equally hard to get the king to stop.
Yeah.
Bismarck realized that they could only push so far before the other great powers stepped in, and all of the work that he had done would be undone.
Bismarck just knows. He's so bright. He has his finger on the pulse of the international community. I feel like I keep emphasizing it, but it keeps being true. He knows so well. If we push too far, not only are we going to get stopped in our tracks, but we're going to be forced to basically give up a lot of our gains. If we stop ourselves, then we can sort of keep this as an internal German squabble, and we can keep all or at least some of what we've already conquered. He just knows exactly what he's talking about. He knows how to play the game so well.
Or still, he believed that once he had eclipsed them, he might need the Austrians to serve as a balance against one of the other great powers.
Yep.
So he must not impose on them a peace that would leave them hating Prussia.
Yep, and I think I mentioned this, I believe, last time when we were talking about his alliance with France, but same thing with Austria. We've seen it in this video. For Bismarck, it's all about pragmatism and practicality. You know, this is not a man who holds grudges. Maybe personally he does, but in terms of politics, that's not how he operates. You know, he allies with Austria in order to take this territory from Denmark. Then he wages this campaign of humiliation and then war against Austria. And then he wants to bring them back in, you know. Maybe not necessarily as the most friendly ally of all time, but at least bring them back from the brink of war. It's all about pragmatism for him. How can he best manipulate these international circumstances so that they're favorable for Prussia? Bismarck really understands this whole balance of power system, as we call it.
So Bismarck called in his erstwhile enemy, the Crown Prince, the same Frederick Wilhelm who he had so unsuccessfully tried to put on the throne as a toddler, and put him to work reining in his father. Fritz, a lover of peace despite being an excellent military commander, convinced the king to accept the deal that Bismarck had on the table. Prussia would take over most of northern Germany. The German Confederation as a body would be disbanded. Their Italian allies would get Venice, and Austria would forever be banned from any pan-German parliament, or from meddling in German affairs. Oh, and weirdly, Liechtenstein became an independent country.
Hey, there you go. And you can already see Bismarck setting up Prussia's future success. Now, sure, at this point, Prussia has not yet unified Germany, but you can already see they're boxing Austria out. This is Prussia basically saying, hey, we are going to be the preeminent German power. And when we go for unification, because you know that's what we're going for, we don't want you getting in the way, Austria. So why don't you back out now and leave it to us?
Oh, that also. All in all, things were looking up for Bismarck's grand project of uniting all of Germany under Prussian rule. There just loomed one more obstacle. One great nation that, although neutral so far, would oppose any further increase in German unity and strength. There was the problem of France.
Oh my. And that is a big problem that Bismarck will have to deal with. And we'll see next time how exactly he deals with the problem of France. I mean, you know, France and Germany, these are pretty iconic enemies. They already have a rivalry, and they're really starting an intense rivalry that will last a bit. Well, at least some interesting consequences, but we'll have to get to all of that next time. I don't want to preempt the next video too much, but we've got some really interesting stuff in store. Once again, this was a fantastic video. We got to see more of Bismarck's brilliance on the international stage. I really do think he's a fascinating character. Once again, you can kind of understand what we're getting to next time. Conflict with France, you know, we're leading up to German unification. I do wonder if we're going to get any of Bismarck's sort of post-unification policy, his domestic policy. I would love if we could talk about that a little bit, because that's some really fascinating stuff. If not, maybe I'll just have to insert that myself. But yeah, we've got some real interesting stuff left. I've really been enjoying this series so far. If you guys have, then I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And hey, leave a comment down below. I always like to read your guys' comments. Always interesting stuff. So anyway, I hope you guys are all having a good day, and I will see you again next time. Goodbye.